By 1942, the Axis powers appeared unstoppable. Across Europe and North Africa, German and Italian forces pushed forward with relentless precision, their tanks and planes cutting through enemy lines with calculated efficiency. In the Pacific, Japanese advances threatened to isolate the United States from its allies, sweeping across islands and ports with naval supremacy. Yet, beneath the surface of these victories, an invisible force was quietly gathering strength. American logistics. From the industrial heartlands of the United States, factories churned without pause. Steel, oil, and rubber flowed from the Midwest and the Great Lakes, transformed into tanks, trucks, planes, and ammunition. Assembly lines that had once produced consumer goods now hummed with the cadence of war. Detroit's automobile plants, Pittsburgh's steel mills, and Pennsylvania's chemical works were more than factories. They were the arteries of an emerging war machine, a lifeline that would stretch across oceans. The Allies' strategy depended on more than battlefield tactics. It depended on the ability to move men, material, and supplies across thousands of miles. American ports brimmed with shipments, loaded onto Liberty ships designed for speed and quantity rather than elegance. Trains, trucks, and convoys crisscrossed the continent, connecting industrial centers to coastal ports where goods would begin the perilous journey overseas. Every crate of ammunition, every barrel of fuel, every ration of food represented a thread in a vast, interwoven system, one that the Axis often underestimated. In Europe, German commanders were preoccupied with the front lines, convinced that they could crush Soviet forces before American industry could tip the scales. Japanese strategists, on the other hand, underestimated the sheer scale of U.S. production and the logistical infrastructure that could support a global war effort. Intelligence reports often dismissed the Americans' capacity to sustain prolonged conflict overseas, assuming distance and time would sap their effectiveness. They failed to grasp that the United States was already thinking in terms of months and years, building reserves far beyond immediate needs. The scale of the American effort was staggering. By mid-1942, the United States was producing nearly 2,000 aircraft per month, alongside tens of thousands of trucks, jeeps, and artillery pieces. Oil refineries ran around the clock, fueling tanks and ships. Even the smallest logistical components, like spare parts for vehicles or wire for communications, were meticulously tracked and shipped to where they would be needed. Military planners knew that victory in modern warfare required more than bravery or tactical genius. It required relentless supply chains, adaptable production, and the foresight to anticipate every eventuality. Across the Atlantic, convoys braved the U-boat threat, a deadly ballet of destroyers and merchant ships. Each crossing was a gamble, with wolf packs lying in wait to cut off supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union. Yet, despite losses, the convoys pressed forward, often escorted by hastily converted warships or aircraft from escort carriers. For every ship sunk, many more slipped through, carrying the raw materials that would sustain the war effort. Meanwhile, American engineers developed innovations such as modular ships, standardized parts, and improved loading techniques, ensuring that even under fire, the flow of materiel would continue. The logistical advantage was not immediately obvious on the battlefield. Soldiers and commanders in North Africa or the Pacific might not see the thousands of tons of fuel, food, or spare parts that kept them moving. Yet, the Axis forces' failure to anticipate the scale of American logistics would soon become painfully clear. The vast production and transport networks meant that the United States could replace losses faster than any Axis power, sustain prolonged offensives, and provide allies with a steady flow of equipment. By late 1942, the combination of American industrial might and meticulous planning began to tip the balance. In North Africa, Allied troops equipped with American Sherman tanks and supplied by trucks rolling across desert highways confronted German and Italian forces at El Alamein. In the Pacific, island-hopping campaigns relied heavily on shipments of ammunition, medical supplies, and engineering equipment. Each success was underpinned by the invisible hand of logistics, a force more decisive than a single tank or aircraft. As the world watched the battles unfold, the Axis remained fixated on tactical victories, dismissing the growing shadow of American supply lines. They underestimated the capacity of a nation that could produce ships faster than they could sink them, trucks faster than they could destroy them, and tanks faster than they could counter them. Every calculation that ignored this logistical juggernaut would soon be proven fatally wrong. The stage was set for a confrontation where speed, strategy, and firepower would meet the quiet, unstoppable momentum of supply chains. The battles to come would reveal the true power of American logistics, transforming not just individual skirmishes, but the entire trajectory of the war. From the factories to the docks, from the warehouses to the front lines, a hidden force was rising, one that the Axis would be unable to contain. And as Allied commanders prepared for major offensives across continents, the question became less about tactics or technology and more about endurance. Who could sustain the fight? Who could feed the armies? Who could keep the guns firing? In this contest, logistics was not a backdrop. It was the decisive weapon. The groundwork of industrial America, combined with careful planning and relentless execution, was about to collide with the Axis on battlefields stretching from North Africa to Europe, from the islands of the Pacific to the skies over Germany. The consequences would be profound, reshaping strategies, altering outcomes, and revealing a truth often ignored in the early years of the war. That victory in World War II would not belong solely to the strongest or the fastest. It would belong to those who could move, supply, and endure beyond expectation. Across the vast theaters of war, American logistics manifested in ways that touched every aspect of combat. Soldiers at the front often spoke not of factories or shipping yards, but of the tangible benefits they delivered. A private in North Africa might describe the relief of finding a freshly supplied ration, the difference between life and death in a desert sun. A medic in the Pacific could rely on steady shipments of morphine, bandages, and medical tools, each crate the result of months of industrial planning. These human experiences, small but essential, reflected the broader network of effort that stretched thousands of miles behind the front lines. Tactically, logistics dictated the tempo of operations. Commanders could plan offensives with confidence because they knew supplies would arrive on schedule. In North Africa, the mobility of Allied forces hinged on American trucks and jeeps, which allowed rapid redeployment across harsh desert terrain. Tank units equipped with consistent fuel deliveries could exploit weaknesses in enemy lines, while artillery batteries, replenished daily, maintained a relentless pounding. The Axis, by contrast, struggled to match this rhythm. Their supply lines were often overstretched, reliant on captured resources or vulnerable railways, leaving them exposed to both attack and attrition. Technological innovation was another angle where logistics proved decisive. American engineers not only built machines, but designed the systems to keep them operational. Modular construction of Liberty ships allowed for faster repairs, interchangeable tank parts, simplified maintenance, and innovations in packaging and palletization accelerated loading and unloading at ports. Even communications equipment benefited, ensuring that the movement of supplies could be coordinated with precision. These innovations were not glamorous, They did not win medals, but they allowed the Allied armies to sustain the pressure that would eventually overwhelm the Axis. Leadership played a crucial role in leveraging this logistical advantage. Figures like General Dwight D. Eisenhower in Europe and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in the Pacific understood that victory depended as much on supply lines as on battlefield tactics. Eisenhower coordinated the flow of American troops and materiel to multiple fronts simultaneously, balancing priorities between Britain, North Africa, and later, the invasions of Italy and Normandy. Nimitz orchestrated the supply of island-hopping campaigns across thousands of miles of ocean, ensuring that every Marine, sailor, and pilot received the equipment they needed to advance against entrenched Japanese positions. Their strategic foresight transformed logistics from a supporting function into a decisive instrument of war. Enemy forces frequently misjudged this dimension of the conflict. German intelligence underestimated the capacity of American production, believing that long supply lines would hinder sustained offensives. Japanese commanders similarly assumed that isolated garrisons could be neutralized before resupply became a factor. These miscalculations meant that, while Axis soldiers fought bravely and often tactically well, they faced opponents whose strength was replenished faster than it could be depleted. The human cost was stark. Frontline soldiers encountered a relentless tide of supplies, reinforcing units and replacing losses with a speed that Axis forces could not counter. Morale intertwined with these angles. Soldiers recognized that every shipment, every crate, every truck carried not just supplies, but confidence. A reliable supply chain reassured troops that they were not fighting in isolation, that reinforcements and relief were possible, and that exhaustion or scarcity would not define their campaigns. Conversely, the Axis faced the psychological toll of dwindling resources. Units in the field understood that shortages of ammunition, fuel, or food could turn a minor setback into disaster. These human elements, fear, relief, and hope, were inseparable from the cold arithmetic of logistics. Even the natural environment played a role in shaping these angles. Deserts, jungles, and mountains tested the resilience of supply networks. American logistical planners adapted with ingenuity, using pontoon bridges to cross rivers, establishing forward supply depots, and modifying vehicles for extreme conditions. This adaptability allowed them to maintain the initiative, moving faster and farther than Axis forces anticipated. Each victory on the map reflected not just combat prowess, but the invisible work of planners, engineers, and laborers who ensured that terrain and weather would not disrupt operations. By examining these multiple perspectives, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy miscalculations, and morale, a clear picture emerges. American logistics was more than a background process. It was a multidimensional force, shaping battles long before soldiers reached the front lines. From the quiet warehouses of Pennsylvania to the chaotic beaches of the Pacific, this system intertwined strategy with execution, endurance with innovation, and human resolve with mechanical efficiency. And as these angles converged, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation where the Axis powers would finally confront the true magnitude of the American logistical machine. Their initial dismissals, their underestimations, and their misjudgments would soon be tested against a tide of men, machines, and supplies moving with unstoppable momentum. By mid-1942, the consequences of underestimating American logistics were becoming painfully clear. In North Africa, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, German and Italian forces faced a well-supplied and coordinated British Eighth Army, bolstered by American trucks, fuel, and materiel delivered across the Atlantic. While Rommel's tanks maneuvered with skill, they were constrained by overstretched supply lines. Ammunition shortages, fuel rationing, and wear on vehicles slowed the Axis advance, while Allied forces, continuously reinforced and resupplied, maintained momentum. Every crate of fuel and shell arriving from American ports tipped the scales, turning tactical engagements into decisive strategic outcomes. Across the Pacific, a similar pattern emerged. During the Guadalcanal campaign, American forces relied heavily on shipments from the United States. Reinforcements, food, artillery, and aircraft, all transported over thousands of miles of ocean, kept Marines engaged and operational under extreme conditions. Japanese forces, despite initial superiority in numbers and familiarity with the terrain, could not match the continuous flow of Allied supplies. Each resupply convoy, often escorted by destroyers or hastily converted aircraft carriers, ensured that troops could endure the harsh climate, illness, and attrition that otherwise might have forced a retreat. The Battle of Stalingrad also revealed the indirect impact of American logistics on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, heavily equipped with American tanks, trucks, and Lend-Lease supplies, were able to maintain pressure on German units trapped within the city. Fuel, trucks, and spare parts delivered from American factories allowed the Soviets to rotate units, reinforce positions, and execute the encirclement that would eventually trap the German Sixth Army. While the Germans focused on the tactical urban struggle, the relentless influx of Allied supplied materiel ensured that the Soviets could sustain operations far beyond what German intelligence had anticipated. Even in the air, American logistical power reshaped the conflict. Long-range bombers, produced in massive numbers in U.S. factories, could be maintained and refueled across Europe thanks to steady supplies of parts and fuel. Fighter planes escorting these bombers arrived in waves, their operations dependent on a constant stream of oil, munitions, and replacement aircraft. German pilots, no matter how skilled, faced an opponent whose numbers and endurance were underwritten by industrial America, a relentless conveyor belt of aviation power. One of the most striking examples occurred during Operation Torch in late 1942. The Allied invasion of North Africa required a meticulously coordinated flow of troops, vehicles, and supplies across the Atlantic. Convoys carrying tanks, jeeps, artillery, and thousands of soldiers faced U-boat attacks, storms, and navigational hazards. Yet, through careful planning, redundancy, and sheer production capacity, enough materiel reached the beaches to sustain the offensive. Axis forces, expecting limited resupply, were met with armored divisions ready to fight, trucks to move them, and ammunition sufficient for sustained engagements. The invasion succeeded, not simply because of battlefield courage, but because logistics allowed Allied forces to fight where and when they chose. In Europe, the logistical advantage became even more pronounced with the planning of D-Day. By 1944, American ports, depots, and shipping networks were operating at an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies were stockpiled across southern England in preparation for the Normandy landings. Troop transports, landing crafts, and fuel depots had been meticulously coordinated. Every element, from medical supplies to bulldozers for clearing obstacles, was accounted for. German commanders, despite fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, could not match this preparation. The Allies' ability to sustain an invasion across the English Channel and into occupied France demonstrated that logistics was no longer a supporting element. It was the decisive factor shaping strategy and execution. The turning point was clear. Wherever American logistics intersected with Axis forces, the outcome increasingly favored the Allies. In battles ranging from the deserts of Africa to the jungles of the Pacific and the plains of Europe, Underestimation of supply chains proved fatal. Each Axis miscalculation, whether ignoring the rate at which Americans could replace tanks, the speed of convoy deliveries, or the efficiency of port operations, amplified battlefield losses. The relentless movement of materiel transformed local engagements into strategic victories, allowing Allied commanders to dictate the tempo and direction of the war. By late 1943, the cumulative effect of these logistical operations had shifted the global balance. Axis forces found themselves outpaced, outsupplied, and increasingly demoralized. Even elite units, trained and experienced, struggled to operate effectively under the strain of disrupted supply lines and shortages. Meanwhile, American production and planning continued unabated, ensuring that every offensive had the endurance to outlast resistance. The battlefield was no longer just a contest of skill or bravery. It was a test of industrial and logistical supremacy, and in that contest, the Axis powers were losing ground irreversibly. In this convergence of planning, production, and execution, the true magnitude of American logistics became undeniable. It was a force unseen yet omnipresent, shaping the outcome of engagements before the first shot was fired, sustaining victories across continents, and gradually eroding the Axis's ability to resist. The turning point had arrived, not in a single battle, but in the cumulative weight of supply, coordination, and foresight meeting the overconfidence of an enemy that had dismissed it for too long. By 1944, the consequences of underestimating American logistics were unmistakable. The Axis powers had been steadily worn down, not solely by superior tactics, but by the relentless momentum of Allied supply. In North Africa, the defeat at El Alamein and the subsequent retreat of German and Italian forces into Tunisia highlighted how sustained resupply could outmatch battlefield skill. Rommel, once celebrated for his tactical brilliance, faced dwindling fuel, insufficient ammunition, and the impossibility of reinforcing positions fast enough to counter Allied mobility. American trucks and convoys, operating in unison with British planning, had tipped the scales. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaigns revealed the full reach of logistics across oceans. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were not won simply through combat prowess, but through the steady arrival of materiel that allowed troops to endure disease, climate, and attrition. Marines could rely on consistent shipments of food, medical supplies, and artillery, while Japanese defenders, increasingly isolated and starved of resources, were gradually overwhelmed. Naval engagements, including convoy protection and the deployment of escort carriers, ensured the uninterrupted flow of supplies, turning long-term operations into victories of endurance and planning. The European theater illustrated the far-reaching impact of American logistical power. The success of the D-Day landings and the subsequent push through Normandy depended on meticulous stockpiling, distribution networks, and rapid deployment of reinforcements. By mid-1944, Allied armies were operating at a scale unmatched in history. American production had provided millions of tons of supplies, tanks, trucks, fuel, and artillery that could replace losses within weeks. German intelligence estimates had consistently underpredicted this capacity, leading to flawed strategies and overstretched defenses. Statistically, the numbers were staggering. By 1945, the United States had produced over 300,000 trucks, more than 88,000 aircraft, and tens of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and naval vessels. Liberty ships delivered millions of tons of cargo, while American rail and port networks ensured rapid distribution to front lines in Europe and the Pacific. These figures were more than industrial feats. They translated directly into sustained combat power, allowing Allied forces to engage the Axis continuously, outmaneuver them strategically, and absorb losses that would have crippled any other belligerent. The psychological impact on Axis troops was equally significant. Reports from German and Japanese units frequently cited frustration over supply shortages. Soldiers faced with inadequate fuel or ammunition were unable to execute planned maneuvers, forced into defensive postures, and increasingly aware that Allied forces could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. This eroded morale, compounded operational risks, and influenced decisions that ultimately accelerated retreat and surrender. Strategically, the Allies were able to dictate the pace and location of engagements. American logistical dominance allowed Eisenhower, Nimitz, and other commanders to coordinate simultaneous campaigns on multiple continents. While Axis leaders concentrated on immediate tactical responses, they were repeatedly forced to react to sustained pressure backed by material superiority. The flow of supplies became a decisive factor in shaping the war's broader trajectory, demonstrating that logistics was no mere support mechanism. It was a strategic weapon. By the end of the war, historians would recognize a clear pattern. Where American logistical networks intersected with Axis forces, victories were increasingly assured. The ability to move, feed, and equip troops across oceans and continents had shifted the balance of power irreversibly. Losses that might have been recoverable for the Axis became insurmountable under continuous pressure, illustrating that the war was as much about supply and endurance as it was about strategy or valor. The aftermath of this logistical supremacy left an enduring legacy. Not only did it accelerate the collapse of Axis defenses, but it also redefined military thinking. Commanders now understood that industrial capacity, planning, and sustained supply could decisively shape campaigns. The war had demonstrated that logistics, often invisible, was in fact the backbone of modern warfare, capable of determining outcomes before the first shot was fired. And as the world would soon witness, the story of supply, its scale, precision, and relentless execution was inseparable from the ultimate Allied victory, setting the stage for reflection on what this meant for the future of warfare and human endeavor. In the quiet after the battles, the scale of what had been accomplished slowly became clear. Victory was not born solely from courage, cunning, or firepower. It had been forged in the warehouses, factories, docks, and convoys that stretched from the American heartland to distant battlefields. Every crate delivered, every truck dispatched, every ship launched carried with it the promise of endurance, the assurance that armies could continue to fight when others would have faltered. American logistics revealed a deeper truth about modern warfare, that the war machine was as much a product of planning and production as it was of strategy and tactics. The relentless momentum of supply allowed soldiers to endure, commanders to maneuver, and nations to sustain the fight across oceans and continents. It transformed battles into campaigns, isolated skirmishes into decisive confrontations, and human determination into a measurable, unstoppable force. Yet, beyond the statistics and strategy, there was a human story. Soldiers relied on this invisible lifeline to survive, to fight, and to hope. Civilians, engineers, dock workers, and factory laborers, often far from the front lines, shaped outcomes with the quiet precision of their work. The war had become a testament to the power of coordinated effort, where every link in the chain mattered, and where victory flowed as much from supply lines as from the front lines themselves. As historians reflect on these campaigns, it is clear that American logistics did more than sustain armies. It redefined the possibilities of warfare. It demonstrated that endurance, foresight, and industrial ingenuity could overwhelm even the most disciplined adversary. In the vast panorama of World War II, the silent march of trucks, the hum of assembly lines, and the arrival of supplies across perilous seas were as decisive as any battle. The legacy remains enduring, that in war, as in life, preparation, perseverance, and the unseen forces working behind the scenes often determine outcomes more than spectacle or heroism. The Axis had dismissed it, and in doing so they met a power they could not contain.